Okay, we are back on the Edlow Podcast with Mr. D-Von Dudley for round two. How you doing, D-Von?
Good. Just woke up. Just
Well,
woke up. My wife had a baby December 19th, and so we are trying to deal with the fact of getting up at all hours of the night, taking care of the baby, sharing the responsibility, of course.
oh man, yeah. That's a rough one, man. I remember those days. My kids are older now, so I don't got to deal with that. It's a much different deal when they're self-sufficient than when they're babies.
Yes. I was crazy enough to start all over again.
Yeah, but I bet that's fun though.
It
Especially being
is.
in this time of your life.
It really is. Most people in this time of their life looking to become grandparents and all of that, but we decided to do a Robert De Niro and, and start all over again. Only
Yeah.
thing is, I'm not 72 years old, so
Well, good. Well, the reason I'll tell listeners, because this is going to be a part two. The
sure.
reason why I had you come on was we spent so much time talking about wrestling, and about the last 5-10 minutes of our last podcast, you started talking about your history, and I was like, oh my gosh, as a podcaster, I have failed in telling probably some of the most interesting stuff about you that hasn't probably been out there much.
Yeah, a lot
And
of my history is not really out there.
yeah, so let's start talking about that. So you mentioned you grew up in Brooklyn, and tell me about your mother and your father and kind of your family.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, 56 Summoner Projects on Nostrand and Myrtle Avenue. And my mother was pregnant at 15 and had me at 16.
Wow.
My biological father was a big time drug dealer.
Mm,
He was out there with some of the likes of a guy named Nicky Bonds, who
mhm,
they pretty much ran New York.
mm,
And he really wasn't in the picture.
mm,
He was out there in the streets running around. His nickname was Hollywood, they called him,
mm,
and that just shows you, he was out there doing his own thing. And my grandmother was the fist of the family.
mm,
She was the one that kept everything together.
mm,
And that was from 72 to, of course, when I was born. She took me in kind of like everybody would tell me that I was kind of like the son she never had because she
mm,
only had one child and my mother.
mm,
And so it was a girl. So when I was born, she kind of took over, so to speak. My mother
mm.
was very young, so she kind of took over, and it was almost like everywhere I went, everywhere she went, I went, and vice versa. So it was me and my grandmother. We had a very, very thick bond, and I even called her mom at times.
Mm,
And getting out of Brooklyn was rough.
yeah.
Now, I didn't have the upbringing like a lot of tragic stories that you hear, but my story was a little tragic. Again, mother was very young, out there in the world before she got saved and in the church, doing her thing. And, my grandmother, like I said, kept everything together. Uh, I didn't meet the preacher until I was 15 years old.
Oh wow. Okay. Can I
Um,
stop you right there? Let me ask you a couple of questions about that. So,
sure.
so tell me, because and I relate to a lot of your story for a couple different reasons. One, my dad. So my dad didn't know his father at all. He was actually the first of three kids in a second family that my grandfather had out of state,
Hmm.
and so he didn't know his dad at all. And then my dad, because he didn't have a father and he struggled and stuff, he grew up in the 60s and 70s. He got into some drugs, and it took him a long time to battle those demons. And and my and so tell me, having it sounds like your mom had a transformation through church. My dad did too. And
Yes.
so
Yeah, I can tell you that it was when things got rough in Brooklyn. Crack first hit the scene
mm,
in '83 in
mm,
Brooklyn, and it ran through the projects like wildfire.
mm,
And it was so bad that people who went to work and made an honest living were turning into junkies and crackheads. And it was like an incredible sight. Kids were being killed and shot because they were either using crack or selling the drug. They were in and out of jail. So it was really rough. And my grandmother and mother saw that. And I had an aunt, my great grandmother sister, who lived in Long Island, and she really didn't have kids. So she wanted kids but could never have them. And so her and her husband basically helped raise my grandmother's sister's son, who was out of control, and took him in and, made him into a great person. And so my mother and grandmother started speaking and said, you know what, we need to get Devon out of here. And how do we do this? And they thought about it and they said, well, why don't we send him? And her name was, we called her Aunt Dottie. Why don't we send him to Aunt Dottie, get him out of here? And at that time, she lived in Long Island, New York, and it was basically like country. It was real country out there. What you see now in Huntington, Long Island is not what used to be in the 80s, 70s, and 80s. It was really country. It was a lot of farms and, cows and chickens and all of that. People had a lot of farms out there, dirt, woods and all of that. And this is before they started developing out there in Long Island. And I went out there, and I went from an all-dominant black school, black and Hispanic school. Now I'm going to school in Long Island. And this was in 1984. And so I went and I went to school out in Long Island, lived with her. Everything turned out great. And I remember at the time I was in sixth grade reading on a third grade level, and I remember my grandmother and mom, weren't aware of this. And there were some tragedies in our lives at that time, people that were very close to us who passed away that were ultimately killed. And so I kind of got lost in the shuffle. And when I went out to Long Island with my Aunt Dottie, she realized the struggle that I had with my grades. And she was like a genius, so to speak. She could take a book, a thick novel, and read it within 10 minutes. That's how good she was in her schooling. And so she basically worked with me and got me on grade level. By the time I got to 8th grade, I was on a reading level.
And tell me, you're on that 8th grade reading level. And in this time frame while you're going through this, are you still in contact with your mom? Are you in contact at all with your dad?
Oh yes, I would go to school. I would go to school Monday and Friday in Long Island, but then go back home to Brooklyn Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. But then on Sunday, of course, get ready to go back for school on Monday. My grandmother was a trooper, man. It was an hour drive from Brooklyn to Long Island, and she did it every weekend. I mean, she would pick me up, work with me, do my laundry, iron my clothes, what have you, put them on hangers and hang them up, and we would put them in the car, hung up like that. And so when I got home, they were freshly done. I mean, she was a trooper, man. She did exactly what a grandmother would do in that aspect, and which is why I loved her so much, because of how she stepped in and did what she did. It's emotional sometimes when I think back, because again, if it wasn't for her, I don't know if I would be sitting here in front of you right now, or where I would be. The quick decision making that she made to get me out of Brooklyn school systems at the time, and to kind of, get my life on track. So it was kind of, it was somewhat of a tragedy in a sense to have to leave and go somewhere else and go to school. But at the same time, it was a blessing. Again, it was culture shock, but at the same token, I enjoyed it to the fullest. At first, for the first, couple of months, I didn't want to be out there. I wanted to be home. But as time went on, I grew to love Long Island, and I
Yeah.
grew to love the kids that were there.
Mm.
And, they opened up to me after a while, after getting to know me, and I opened up to them. And, it was one of those things where, now all of a sudden, it's like I'm fitting right in.
Yeah.
And the first time that I started going to church was with my aunt. She was a very religious person. And
Mm.
we went to church, and she basically had me in the choir
Mm.
singing. I was playing the drums
Mm.
and everything. And we had a choir anniversary. Every year they had an anniversary. And I invited my mother.
Mm.
And I remember I'm up there singing, and, again, she was out there in the world doing her thing, and I remember her just sitting there watching me.
Mm.
And you can tell the look on her face was just in amazement.
Mm.
And, she leaned forward onto the pew with her hand like this most of the time watching me sing, and had a hand like this. And at that point in time, because we've talked about it, she had a come to Jesus moment.
Mm.
And she realized that the things that she was doing was wrong, and things like that. So she went and got herself together. She went to theological seminary school, and started coming to church every week, getting into the word, and basically got
Wow.
saved, and then became a preacher on
Wow.
top of
So,
that.
so
Mhm.
tell me how long from that moment where she saw you in the choir to her entering the seminary?
It was very quick. It was very
Man,
quick. I mean, she was saved instantly. I mean, Jesus has touched her so quick, so
man.
fast.
It's
And
isn't it interesting? It's so interesting. I served a mission for my church in Indiana, and I'm sure it's nothing like Brooklyn, but the inner cities of Indianapolis, they can be pretty rough too. And
absolutely.
it's amazing. In fact, I remember ECW had they'd been to Fort Wayne and different areas like that, and they're rough area. There's some rough areas out there, but it's amazing to see how I saw it firsthand. How somebody who catches faith, how much that can change their lives. And it's cool to hear that
Yeah.
that's what happened with you. And
Yeah.
so,
I mean, again, I was, at the time, it was what, 87. So I had to be, I think I was like 13, 14 years old.
mhm,
And at that point in time, my life was changing just dramatically. Didn't even realize how much it was changing
mhm,
for the good, not
yeah,
for the words, for the good. Living in Long Island, doing what I was doing. Like I said, it was like Saved by the Bell,
yeah,
Well, Screech, and if you remember the TV show Screech,
yeah,
Zach, all of that.
I
I
do.
mean, that's the characters that we had at the school that I went to, which was John Glenn High School
Yeah,
in East Northport, Long Island, in Huntington.
mhm,
And so
mhm,
it was one of those things where I'll never forget
mhm,
growing up there. And I think that kind of saved my life and made
mhm,
me who I was today, because my whole outlook on life had changed at that point.
yeah,
And then I remember 1988 comes around, and she met my dad, and
mm,
my father came in and took on the responsibility of having, two kids that my
mhm,
mother had, myself and my brother, and they formed a marriage, and got together, and it was like magic. And we
mhm,
we left Brooklyn and Long Island at that point in 88, 89. And I was going into my junior year, and we went to New Rochelle, New York.
mm,
Went to New Rochelle, New York, and I finished my junior and senior year there. It's funny how when I basically see some of the places on where they say I grew up, he grew up in New Rochelle. Oh, he grew up in Long Island. No, I grew up in Brooklyn, but I
mm,
entered, New Rochelle and Long Island. That's what people don't understand. I grew
yeah,
up mostly in Brooklyn, but I do acknowledge Long Island, and I definitely acknowledge New Rochelle. And it was funny because I went from, like I said, that Saved by the Bell type of school atmosphere to now I go to New Rochelle and it's like a rainbow coalition. It was like every race you could possibly think of now
Mhm.
in New Rochelle, because New Rochelle is on the border of the Bronx.
Mm.
It's like right there in it's in Westchester, but
Okay.
it's like right there on the skirts of everything. We're about an hour away from New York City, things like that. So, you had
Mm.
everybody there, and it was great. I mean, I had a great time in New Rochelle. I
Mm.
met my first wife there, the twins' mom, my son's mom, who we got married, years on. And, my father, my stepfather at the time, took the responsibility of raising myself and my brother. And he basically really taught us a lot. He was a very, very good man. Taught us business, how to handle business, things like that, how to be respectful
Mhm.
towards others, and just how to handle yourself in general.
Mm.
And he passed away in 2003, but man, he was something else. I mean, his
Mm.
name, my son is named after him, but one of my sons is named after him. But man, he was something else.
Mm.
Never will forget that man, and so grateful for what he had done. As far as I'm concerned, that is my father.
Wow. Now, tell me, in this whole time, I mean, we know you eventually become one of the most famous professional wrestlers in history. Where does wrestling come into the picture? Are you a fan as you're growing up?
Absolutely. I mean, in Brooklyn,
Mm.
before I left the school systems out there, I was watching WWF
Mm.
at the time, and I remember my grandmother, my mother, and I. We were at what they called a house party, not like the movie house party, wild and stuff, but it was kind of like when the older people got together. They played cards. They had a couple of drinks. We ate dinner and things like that, and the kids would go off in the bedroom and watch TV until the adults were done. And I remember turning the TV on one time and flipping through the channels, and I saw wrestling,
Mm.
and had no idea what it was, couldn't tell you. And I just remember at that time seeing Bob Backlund
Mm.
uh, come on the TV. And then, he was talking about it. This is back when Vince used to hold the mic and do interviews.
Yeah.
Nobody ever knew that Vince, I don't think he was the owner at that time, but nobody
Right.
knew anything about, the ins and going on in professional wrestling at that time. And, he's holding the mic and he's interviewing Backlund. And we go to commercial break. We come back, and now Big John Studd
Mm.
is being interviewed, and now Studd is talking about what he's going to do to Backlund when he
Mm.
sees him in the ring at Madison Square Garden, and how he was going to tear him alive and beat him from every inch of his life. And I remember being horrified. I was like, "Oh my God, this big man is going to kill this little man." And I told my grandmother, she came in the room and she says, "All right, Devon, let's go. We're getting ready to leave." And I said, "Grandma, you got to see this." I was like, "This big man is threatening to beat up this little man." And she was like, "What are you talking about?" And when I showed her, she said, "Oh boy, that's wrestling. Ain't nobody looking at that." And because that was back then, that was when pro wrestling wasn't looked upon like it is now.
Right.
It was taboo. You didn't say that you were a wrestling fan or even that you enjoyed wrestling.
Yeah.
So, and it's funny because fast forward to, what was it, like 10 years later, my grandmother is in the bed with me watching pro wrestling, jumping and cheering and carrying on just as loud as I was.
Yeah.
She was a big fan of Mr. Johnson, the Rock's dad, Rocky
Uh-huh.
Johnson. And she was crying when they won the tag team title, because they were the first African American tag team to ever win a title,
Mm.
in a company like the WWF. And it was kind of like that moment where she kind of felt like we started to overcome,
Mhm.
because she had seen so much stuff growing up. And to now actually see that, and for the WWF at the time to recognize that, that was huge in a lot of black homes. And I
Yeah.
don't think that's what a lot of people don't understand back then, because growing up, it was like hard. I mean, even though you had SD Jones, Junkyard Dog, back then, it was very, very uncommon to see people that looked like us,
Mm.
that were successful, that were
Mhm.
winning. and things like that, especially growing up in Brooklyn, because all you heard was the tragic stories and, things like
Right.
that. So to actually see that on TV, it was mind boggling to a lot of African Americans. And even to this day, when I talk to a lot of Black people about during that time that they can remember, they say the same words.
Yeah.
This is why, I think a lot of Black people were offended by Vince when a lot of stereotypes were going on in the
Mhm.
wrestling business at the time, especially with the hottest company around, even back then, was WWF. A lot of
Mhm.
people were taken back by that, and it was just one of those things where I think, you know, being Black, growing up in the 70s and 80s, you got to remember the Jim Crow laws and the racial tension in the South wasn't even more than 10 years old at that point.
Right.
So, we're still dealing with racism and, Black people, feeling certain ways about how they felt and fit in, to society. It was still raw,
Yeah.
and so the escape was, for me and so many others, pro wrestling. It gave you that fantasy to forget about what was going on in the real world
Mhm.
and, enjoy yourself at the time of what you were seeing being portrayed on TV. So at that point, I saw, like I said, Big John Studd and Bob Backlund, and I fell in love. And
Yeah.
then, of course, a certain bleach blonde guy came on the scene after doing Rocky 3, and forget about it. Hulkamania. I tell people all the time, you don't understand the
Mhm.
power that Hogan had when he
Mhm.
captivated an audience. It's one thing to hear people talk about it, but when you lived it and you saw it and you felt it during that time, if you weren't there, you couldn't fathom what we felt as kids and how mesmerizing this man was.
I'll
You
tell I'll tell
know,
you I'll tell you a story about that. There was a house show here at the Arco Arena, and when I was a little kid, and the main event was, I mean, they'd come through a few times and they did real well, but Hogan, Macho Man, and we went to the show. It was a sellout. He came out. It was the most crazy. It was the craziest I've ever seen anybody. And they went to a count out, right? Macho Man. I can't remember if Macho Man won by count out or Hogan won by count out. And so they announced right afterwards that they were selling tickets that night. They're going to be back in a month for the rematch. Sold
mhm,
out that night. Everybody bought
yep.
a ticket to come back. I mean, that was for house shows. I mean, those weren't
Hmm.
televised events. I mean, he was huge. Did you ever get a chance to meet Hogan, and what was that like?
Oh, absolutely. I saw Hogan when Hogan came back to the WWE with
Mhm.
Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, and I'll never forget it. Me and Bubba are in the car heading to the Staples Center, and we meet downstairs. We start driving. He goes, your boy's gonna be there tonight, right?"
Mhm.
And I go, "Who are you talking about?" He goes, "Hogan and Nash and Scott Hall." I was like, "Oh, Hogan's gonna be there." I was like, "Oh, okay, cool." I'm playing it off like it's nothing.
Yeah,
Like, oh, all right, cool. All right, Hogan's gonna be there. What do you want me to do? Jump up and down?
yeah.
So we walk into the building, and as we walk into the building, I started walking, and I put my bag down in the locker room. I come back out to the front, and I was like, "Oh man, I forgot my phone. Let me go back." And as I go back, I start walking. Here comes Hogan walking down the aisle. I literally panicked and ran in the other opposite direction, because that was the first time I had ever seen him. And, I'm like, "Oh my God, it's Hogan." I ran, went across, and I said, "Devon, get yourself together." I'm like, okay, breathe, breathe. So, of course, Bubba gets to see him before I do because Bubba's standing right there and he's talking with Hogan, Nash, and Scott Hall. And now all of a sudden, Bubba goes, "Oh yeah, it is Devon." So I walk over. I said, "Hey, how you doing, Scott?" And I had met Scott and Kevin before, so that was no big deal. But
Mhm.
then I go to Hogan. I go, "Mr. Hogan, I'm nervous as hell.
Yeah.
Oh, how you doing?" And he goes, "Devon, get the tables." I've been wanting to say that for the longest. I just went, when somebody's shocked, I'm like, "What the hell?"
Yeah. Hogan
I was like,
knows
"Did
who
he
I
just?"
am.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was like, "Did he just do that?" He's like, oh man, my son Nick loves you. Man, we do that all the time. We go around the house going, Devon, get the table. And I just remember saying to myself, damn, I finally arrived.
Yeah, that's the
When
thing. Like, you saying that, and as a guy, so I graduated high school in 1999. So like 98, 99, 95 to 99, that's when wrestling was hot. That's when everybody came out of the closet as wrestling fans, right? Everybody admitted it. And to hear, I'm just sitting here and I'm envisioning the first meeting of the Dudley Boyz and the Outsiders. And I'm just like, that's a match I would have loved to see. Did you ever have a match with them? I don't think you ever did you?
Yeah, we did. TNA.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we did in TNA, and we went over.
There you go. They put you over.
They
Wow.
put us over. It was great. I remember the first encounter with Scott Hall. And Kevin brings it up every once in a while. God rest Scott. So he came up to us and he was like, this was that night. This was that night that I met Hogan at the Staples Center. He goes, the Dudley Boyz, what's going on, yo? He was like, what's that thing that you guys do? And Bubba goes, and we're standing together. Bubba goes, what do you mean? He goes, that finisher you got. What do you call it? He goes, oh, it's 3D. He goes, yeah. Scott goes, yeah. He goes, I can't wait to get in the ring with you guys. So then when you hit me with that move, 1, 2, I'll just kick out. And Bubba goes, he looked at him with his face. Scott, I'm going to tell you this right now. Nobody kicks out of 3D. You understand what I'm saying? And then Kevin sees that. He goes, well, no, Scott didn't mean that. He was like, Scott's just joking around. Ain't that right, Scott? Because when they came back, a lot of people were not happy because, the whole click thing and, then plus you had the horror stories you heard in WCW. So nobody was really happy when those guys came to the WWE at the time. And that was publicly known. People had mentioned that and the word was out there about that. So Kevin told us, he goes, when we walked away, he picked Scott. He was like, idiot, we're already trying to make friends. And you talk to one of the top line tag teams in here. Somebody, you're going to kick out of their finish. Are you out of your mind? Stop making enemies, Scott. And Scott, what did I do, bro? He's like, hey, yo, what did I do?
That's awesome.
It was great. But then, we became to love Scott and, never had a problem with Scott. Even when we worked together, Scott was a complete professional and gentleman, and Kevin was as well. And, to this day, Kevin and I and Bubba, we sit and laugh and joke and, talk about the good old days. I never thought I'd be at this point in my career when I'm talking about the past, reminiscing like the old timers used to do when I was a young kid. It's like I never thought I would get to that point, but I'm old as shit, man.
well, it's so interesting. I want to know. So your family, you're deeply entrenched in the church. I mean, your mom is now goes to theological school, becomes a minister, and you talked on the last podcast about how she raised 4 kids and they're all doing so successful. And you talk about all these things. What was the reaction when you were like, I'm going to go train to be a pro wrestler? What did your family think?
My father wasn't happy. My mother was outraged. I had a 4-year scholarship to play football, and I turned it down because number one, my career never got off the way I thought it should have been in New Rochelle, and I was like, how the hell did this happen? I was like, and there was so much politics going on, even at the high school level. I said to myself, I was like, why am I going to get involved in this? I was like, I'm only going to wind up being miserable like I was my last 2 years at New Rochelle High School. When it came to me playing, I was like, I should just stop and just do what I want to do. My love was professional wrestling. And I remember telling my mother, I said, yeah, I'm gonna do professional wrestling. And she looked at me as if to say, if you don't get the hell away from me with that stupid nonsense, I'm gonna knock the hell out of you. And I was like, I didn't say anything. And then all of a sudden I went down to Johnny Rods' school. My grandfather gave me the money to give it to Johnny to pay for my schooling. I paid my grandfather every dime. He never had to come looking for me when it came to pay him back. And I wanted to make sure that happened because, most people, when you borrow money from family members, you always got to go looking for them because they want to duck and dive. But they weren't doing that when they were asking you for the money. But when it
Yeah.
came time to pay the money, now all of a sudden, they want to hide. They don't want to
Yeah.
accept your phone calls no more.
Yeah.
And
I
it
was
got
joking with my son. I'm like, hey, if you ever want to get rid of somebody, just loan them some money. You'll never see them again.
gone, gone.
Yeah.
And it had gotten to the point where I would come home and it was constant arguments,
Mhm.
because I didn't take the scholarship and I didn't go play football. Um, and at that time, all I saw was pro wrestling. I
Mm.
didn't see anything else. And my father wasn't happy with it, but he understood. But my mother just wasn't listening at all. So, being the preacher's son, it just did not fall over at all in my parents' household. So, like a lot of kids, I had to pack my stuff and get my own place
Yeah.
and
Did
make my
you
dream come
did
true.
so when you're doing this though, I mean, is there a point where's the point where they kind of get on board and say, "Hey, you did good"? Is it an ECW or when you move to WWE?
My father, my father was okay during the ECW days. He basically, I would show him clips of it, and even with the cursing and carrying on, he was okay with it.
Mm,
Because he said, that's what you're doing on TV. I know how you are in real life, and
yeah.
that's not you.
It's
My
actually pretty
mother,
interesting. It's actually pretty interesting. Sorry to interrupt, but it's interesting to hear that especially if he wasn't a wrestling fan, to understand the character aspect of it, because so many people don't. You know what I mean? Like
mhm,
they don't separate Hulk Hogan from Terry Bollea, right?
right,
And so they don't separate D-Von Dudley from Devon at home. You know what I mean? And so it's
hmm
interesting that your dad was able to do
I mean, he was great. Now, my mother, on the other hand, no.
that.
Even during ECW, she was not budging. The only time she changed was when I got to WWE and I was on TV performing. When I was performing in Madison Square Garden or wherever I was on TV, that was when things started changing. And when she saw the money,
Mm,
when she saw the money coming in and my life started changing, that was when she was happy. I remember, in black churches, I've never seen this. I mean, in an all black, because like a lot of churches, white churches, I don't see this with the families. Where in black churches, when church is over, the black families will go in the back of the church and wait for the congregation to leave and see the congregation out the door. It's
mm,
every Sunday, and I remember people coming up to us, God bless you and all of that. And blah, blah. And one person said, "Oh man," it was like, "Look at this. Is this your son? Is this the wrestler? Is this the
mm,
one you were telling us about?" Oh my God, my nephew loves him, or my son loves him. Oh my
mm.
God, you know, you've got to be so proud of him. My mother goes, I'm extremely proud of him. I think it's great, and blah blah blah. I was in his corner the whole time. I looked at her. I took a step. I took a step to the left, and she said, "Baby, what's wrong?" I said, lightning can strike even indoors."
Yeah.
And she said, "Oh, stop it." I was like, "All right." So of course we're in the car. I was like, "Why'd you lie to that woman?" I was like, "You sort of be a woman of the cloth. Why'd you lie?" And she was like, "Well, what do you want me to say?" I was like, "The truth. How you were totally against what I was doing."
Yeah.
And oh, stop it, I wasn't. And then of course we never brought that up again.
Yeah. Your football, what did you play?
I had two positions. I was offensive tackle,
Mm.
and nose tackle, and then defensive tackle. So I
Oh,
played
wow.
three different positions. But by the time I got to high school, senior year, we were talking about changing my position just to a linebacker because I was a big kid when I first started, but then as I got to like my senior year, now you got men,
Mm.
people that grew up and they were a lot bigger than me. So, and I was kind of quick at the time, moving off the ball and all that. So the coach decided that he was going to make me a linebacker, so that way I would be able to continue my football career and not get eaten up on a defensive line.
Right.
And he was right, but I just never excelled the way I wanted to as a linebacker, and I thought
Mm,
there was a lot of politics that was involved. So again, I just gave it up, and I didn't want to do it anymore. I was
yeah.
just tired of it. And pro wrestling, Hulkamania, just blew my mind, and all I could see was Hulkamania all day, all night. That's all I wanted to do.
Man. So now looking back on that, I mean, it's crazy because, and I kind of do this too, because statistically, I didn't, I didn't grow up in like in an urban area. Generally get, my area was nice and stuff like that. But with my family makeup and the history, I sometimes look back and go, man, I dodged a lot of bullets. I was able to make it,
Yeah.
and do you ever look back and just tell me? I think you've kind of already talked about how grateful you are for everybody around you, the community that helped build who Devon is today.
Hmm.
Talk to me a little bit in this last few minutes because I know you have a heart out about what that origin story means to you now that you're a little bit older and can reflect.
Well, again, growing up the way I did, um, I'm not supposed to be a success story. I'm supposed to
Mhm.
be a tragedy in a lot of people's eyes. Mom pregnant at 15, had me at 16. Father was a big time drug dealer, did what he did, and then the preacher comes in later on and does the save. It was like he made the hot tag.
Right.
It's one of those things. It means so much because a lot of kids out there are facing what I went through or worse
Mhm.
than what I went through and yet never make it out. Never
Yeah.
have those people that can help them to build their lives and to get out of where they are growing up, and show them the right way of doing things. I looked at pro wrestling during the rock and wrestling era with Cyndi Lauper and them as my role models.
Mhm.
When Hogan said, say your prayers, eat your vitamins, and train, I listened.
Mhm.
So when people say, oh, athletes aren't role models, their parents are, yes, their parents are role models, but the people that they're watching on TV that are bigger than life, they're role models too. So it's very important that we watch what we do out here because of the fact that these kids are watching and they are doing exactly what we tell them to do. So I'm very happy in that aspect that my life turned out the way it did, with the hard work, even the struggling along the way, because there were some struggles.
Yeah.
There were some struggles with I did not have money,
Mhm.
to do things. I worked in the post office and I was struggling,
Yeah.
to take care of my first wife and my twin sons. It was a struggle and I made it. I
Yeah.
made it through all of that.
Yeah.
And there were times where I didn't know how we were going to eat. There were times where I didn't know how the rent was going to get paid, but God made it happen. As long as I stayed the path, it happened.
Yeah.
So, me giving all honor to God and my Savior Jesus, I love that. I get teared up, every time I think about it because, again, there's no telling where I would be,
Yeah.
without all of that. And yeah, I stirred away from the church and I was out there, as a young kid, getting involved in the lifestyle of being on TV and famous. Never got into drugs, but unfortunately, the women
Mhm.
was my demon of
Mhm.
choice. And
Mhm.
luckily, I did not, um, get into it real bad with that. I
Mhm.
had my
Mhm.
fun, and if that's what you want to call it, I had my fun, and that was it.
Mhm. Yeah.
I was delivered from it and saved from it. And a lot of times when people ask me, I go, it was only through the grace of God that I didn't get in trouble,
Mhm.
or, have kids outside,
Mhm.
of wedlock or what have you. It was only through the grace of God that He kept me straight, even though I veered to the left when I should have kept straight, but He got me right back on track.
Well, the
And I
beauty
had
the
to,
the beauty of that, real quick, is the beauty of I don't think people understand, with a Christian background, is the beauty of the idea of Jesus is that we all do that. We all veer left, and you can still make it right. And it doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter. You could be saved and you still make a mistake here and there,
hmm
and rectify it. And I think like I said in the last one, it's big of you to admit those mistakes. A lot of people won't.
oh, Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to come clean. You can't sit here and pretend like you're all holier than thou when you're not. You
Yeah.
know, some of the biggest names in the Bible, failed,
Pretty
and
terrible
God,
people back there.
oh my God, and God forgave them and basically did what he had, and they did what they had to do to clean themselves back up, where they were back in God's good graces. That's the one thing I say. You can mess up, and God will still be there to help you. There were so many times where I messed up, and I should have been like some of these other tragic stories out there, broke and not having anything, a dime to my name. But yet, every time I got to that point in my life where I might have hit rock bottom, he lifted me right back up.
Yeah. You know,
So many times.
listen, you got a heart out. I know that. So I have one last question that I really wanted to get to you, and that's this. There's a lot of people out there right now, politicians and the like, who look at young people and tell them you can't do it, right? They
Hmm.
look at people who might have been in your situation or my situation and say, hey, a lot of negativity out there.
Yes.
Given your story, what is the message you would give to those young people if they're listening?
Regardless to what you're going through, regardless to what life hands you, don't sit there and say, it's over. Or don't sit there and think that you can't overcome what you're going through. Lean on God and trust in Him. There's an old saying in the Bible, He may not come when you want Him, but He's always on time.
Mhm.
Just when you think it's over, he steps right in and takes over. Think about it. All the times that you have hit rock bottom or you have done things that wasn't good and you felt that you were abandoned or what have you, just when you were at your last end's wit, somehow or another you got pulled from the trenches and pulled right back up on your feet again. That's the grace of God, and you have to understand that that's what he does. You will hit rock bottom. You will sit there and go through the trials and tribulations and the storm, but know that in the end, joy will come in the morning. And you
Yeah.
have to keep the faith and know that regardless of how hard it gets, you have to know that God
Mhm.
has you and he's got a bigger plan for you. And that's what I always feel. And that's what I like to tell a lot of young people. Don't worry about the storm that you're going through. Because if I'm not mistaken, the Bible says, you know, if you lean on him, you will see that joy. You know, uh, what is it? How does it go? Sorrow, you know, sorrow might come at night, but joy comes in the morning.
Yeah.
And when you wake up and you understand that, you know that. And I've always, and there's another saying, I learned how to let go and let God.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of podcasts, and this is why I'm very grateful for your show, because a lot of podcasts don't want to hear stuff like that. They want to hear tragedy. They want to hear about people talking about this one and talking about that one. They don't ever want to hear about how God might have brought them from where they once was to where they are now. They
Yeah.
always want to put the caption, somebody, there was a train wreck, and this, like for instance, the Tammy Sitch, thing,
Yeah.
where now she's doing 17 years because of what she has been through and this and that. They're quick to put that on the front page of their website. But let Tammy come out of that, give herself to God, and do what she has to do to get right, and that you won't even hear about that.
Yeah.
You
It's
won't
true.
even hear about that. You'll hear about the tragedy of what she did to get her in this position, but you won't put out there what she did to get herself right.
Right. Well, I got to tell you, Devon, I can tell you're a preacher's son, and I can, and it's always cool to hear where my heroes have come from, and you're definitely one of them. You've had a profound effect on my life. You and Bubba Ray. I met him at TNA, and he was a very hard man when I met him, and and but you guys really have had a profound effect on the lives of my kids. They know who you guys are too, and I'm just grateful we had this opportunity.
Well, my biggest thing is that, I pray to God, I say, I'm going to get Bubba in church. I'm gonna get him in church. I'm gonna get him on his knees and confessing that God is the King. I'm gonna get him, and I tell him that all the time. He goes, "Yeah, okay." I'm like, "I'm gonna get you in church. I'm gonna get you in church one way or another."
I can't wait to see it happen. That'll be awesome.
Oh, I'm a videotape and put it all over Twitter.
Right on. Well, I know you got to go pick up your daughter, so thank you for the time. I appreciate it, D-Von. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for indulging me.
Oh, thank you for having me on again and again. I would love to come on, and I can talk for days. I'm gonna tell you that right now. I can talk for
I'm
hours
sure we'll do it again. We'll do it again for sure. So
absolutely. Thank you so much, and thank you for being one of the most respectful podcasters I had ever been on, if not the most respectful podcast I've ever been on. It was a joy today. It was a joy the other day. And again, if we had more people like you out there spreading the message of stuff like this, social media wouldn't be so bad.
well, thank you. I appreciate that. That means a lot to me. Thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.